Welcome to Carmel Winery at Rishon wine cellars. This is where the history of the modern Israeli wine industry began. This is where they made wine for 120 years. The winery was built by Baron Edmund de Rothschild. And in 2011, the wine making passed from here to Zichron Yaakov. The winery which went through 30 million shekels refurbishment to bring the winery into the 21st century. And it's in Zichron Yaakov today that you see the best of modern Carmel with the advanced technology in a historical building of 120 years old. Here at Rishon LeZion, you see the history. You see the birth of Israeli wine. You see the footsteps of people who worked for Carmel like David Ben-Gurion. And it reeks of history. But you have to put it in context. It's now a historical building, but the modern winemaking has passed to Zichron Yaakov. This is the logo of Carmel, which was the two spies sent by Moses to the Promised Land. When they got near Hebron, they cut down the fruit of a bunch of grapes which was so big that they had to put it on a pole and carry it between two men. And when they returned to Moses, they said, "This is a land of milk and honey, and this is the fruit." This is the Baron, the great benefactor, Hanadiv Yodua. Baron Edmund de Rothschild. He was born in 1845. He died in 1934. He's buried in a beautiful park, Ramat Nadiv, overlooking his vineyards and his wineries. He founded Carmel, and he really revived an Israel wine industry after 2,000 years. The Baron was a banker. He lived in Paris. He was a collector, an art collector. He has a big collection in the Louvre. But he was also owner of Chateau Lafite Rothschild, which is arguably the most famous winery in the world. So it was very easy for him to send the expertise, the agronomists, the viticulturists, and the winemakers and the equipment in order to found Carmel Winery when he built Rishon LeZion in 1890 and Zichron Yaakov in 1892. This is a eucalyptus, which look how big it is. It's been here probably since the founding of Carmel. Think of the changes this tree has seen. So everything here at Rishon LeZion has a relationship to the history of the area because it's been here a long time, this tree. It's seen a lot of changes at Carmel. The first vineyard was planted by new immigrants that came from Russia in Rishon and new immigrants that came from Romania in Zichron. They planted the first experimental vineyards. In 1882, they sought help from the Baron. And the Baron, who wanted to help Jews in the Holy Land, in Eretz HaKodesh, sent an expert to survey the land. And when they surveyed the land in December 1882, their findings were, you should plant grapes. This is an Eastern Mediterranean country. Grapes will thrive here. And so by 1884, the different settlements decided to concentrate on grapes. In 1887, Baron Edmund de Rothschild arrived in Israel for the first time. He fell in love with the country. He fell in love with the idea of reviving a wine industry in Israel. And he decided to build the two biggest wineries in Israel by far, at Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov, which he did in 1890 and 1892. So firstly, when they founded the winery, they called the wines from the cellars of Rishon and Zichron. There was no brand name. Then in 1895, Mr. Louis Epstein from Rehovot came to the Baron and said, "I want to do a deal with you. You take my grapes and I'll give you an answer to selling your wines abroad." They came to an agreement, and Louis Epstein founded a company to market Carmel wines abroad, and it was called the Carmel Wine Company because the root of Carmel is Carmel, which means God's vineyard. The Zichron winery sits on Mount Carmel, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. And also they decided then that Carmel had a good ring to it, both in English and Hebrew. So that was why they decided on Carmel, but it was an export marketing name. And Carmel became the first Israeli export. They opened the first branch in Poland in 1896. in England in 1898. They went to Vienna, Odessa, Hamburg, Berlin. They got to America in 1900. And that's quite a story, because most of the American wineries started after Prohibition, but Carmel was there before in 1900. So the chairman of Carmel Wine Company was a person called Zev Gluckstein. In 1902, he returned to Israel and was made manager of the two wineries. And he said, I want to make use of this word Carmel. It's such a good brand name. So I'm going to think up a new brand name, so there is no confusion between Carmel Wine Company, which is Europe and America, and the rest of the world. So he decided on the name Carmel Oriental. Now, the Oriental in those days meant the Near East. No one had any idea that Oriental, like today, means the Far East, so they called it the Near East. So Carmel was composed of two companies: Carmel Wine Company, which was export company, and Carmel Oriental to sell in what was really the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire in those days was Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Damascus, Beirut, Jaffa and Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Cairo. Carmel even had a branch in Cairo. So Carmel Oriental, Carmel Wine Company, and the wineries Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov. This was the company called Carmel. Of course, the translation of Carmel Oriental was Carmel Mizrahi, and that's how the Mizrahi came into Carmel Mizrahi, which was the name for 100 years until 2004, when the company was changed to Carmel Winery. This is the famous old winery building of Israel. It was the first commercial winery in the country. From 1890, it was built by the Baron. This building was the first brewery ever in Israel. It was called the Nesher Brewery. It was founded in 1934, and the Nesher brand and the first Gold Star ever were produced here. The first Nesher was produced in 1934. The first Gold Star was produced in 1950. Of course, who drank beer in those days? Only the British. So when the British left Israel, the market declined, and in the end of the day, they closed the brewery in 1960. But they tell me there used to be a wall here between the winery and brewery, and the workers used to come to the wall before Shabbat and do a barter. Someone used to say, give me a book of Kiddush wine, and I'll give you a bottle of beer. And that's happened. And we also hear the folklore of the winery is that the brewmaster of the brewery and the winemaker used to get together after 5 in the evening, of course, used to get together in the evening, try each other's product, and end up to the early hours drinking together. This is the entrance to the accounts department. And this way it used to be the brewery office. And the only clue that's left at the winery that was once a brewery here is this Nesher. So Nesher was the first brand of beer in Israel. And this is the Nesher at Rishon LeZion, where the first brewery ever existed. This is the garden of the Shevat Minim, the seven species that were blessed by God, including olive trees and grapevines, and you'll see the 7 species all in this little garden here. But there are a number of small little buildings spaced out inside the grounds of the winery, and this is one of them. And what happened is, because Rishon LeZion, the winery, was here before the town Rishon LeZion, the workers of Rishon lived on site. So the winemaker would have lived in one house, the manager of the operations would have lived in another house, and you can see the little houses still exist in different parts of the winery. You'll see them in different areas, and it shows when the winery was actually a village where people lived, self-sufficient village where people lived. And they made the wine the first year, and all the French experts didn't realize how hot it was in July and August, so all the wine went to vinegar. So the second year, they bought the first ever ice machine from Egypt with great big blocks of ice that they put in big barrels like this one to reduce the temperature of the fermentation, and it didn't work. So the second year, the wine went to vinegar. The third year, they decided to put in some water pipes inside that would fit a spiral of water pipes inside the barrels and run cold water through them. And it was a bit better, but still it wasn't good enough to keep the temperature. So the Baron decided then he had no alternative but to build the deep underground cellars that he built here. He built 6 cellars here, 6 at Zion-Carmel, at an enormous cost of 11 million francs. To buy Chateau Lafite cost his father 5 million francs. To buy Chateau Mouton Rothschild cost his nephew 1 million franc. Now the idea of these deep underground cellars was to lower the temperature during July and August and to raise the temperature during January and February. So it was before there was electricity, and it was a way of keeping a good temperature for the wine so it wouldn't go off. When this winery was built, it was one of the biggest wineries in the world. When Carmel was built, it was very, very state-of-the-art. There was a winemaker from Bordeaux. They had all the latest equipment. It was very high-tech for a winery in those days. And they had all the items and all the equipment they needed to make wine of an international standard. They even had grapes from cuttings from Chateau Lafite itself. This is the historic Belle of the winery. So through this Belle, they managed to let the workers know when it was time for breakfast, when it was time for break, when it was time to pray. So this Belle was a way of communicating, the only way of communicating with all the workers surrounding the winery. The first electricity ever in Israel was here at Rishon LeZion, and the first telephone ever in Israel was at Carmel Winery at Rishon LeZion. It shows that what an advanced winery it was in those days. These are old cement tanks which replaced the wooden barrels outside because they could get more capacity. These cement tanks are part of history. It's a museum piece, interesting to see. But cement tanks have come back in. So at Zion-Carmel, we've brought experts over from Italy, and they have done a refurbishment of the cement tanks, and they're now part of our winemaking program. This is the entry to a barrel cellar, just to give a clue of something that is to do with winemaking in Israel. This is the spirits department. Until 2005, Carmel used to make spirits like arak, vodka, liqueurs. Do you remember Melody liqueurs? And all kinds of different spirits products and liqueur products. Carmel used to make olive oil and gourmet food products. And they used to make the vodka and arak and the white spirit in this column still, which you see, it has to be very long to get the purity of alcohol. And inside there's also the pots, 4 old pot stills that we used to make brandy. In 2005, Carmel decided to close the spirits section to concentrate on becoming a winery again. And you can see the change in the quality of the wine since then. So these roofs are very associated with Carmel Winery in Rishon LeZion. They appeared in many labels. Many old pictures, you see these roofs. And of course, this is really the spirits department where the barrels were kept and cleaned for storing the brandy. This is an old gat, an old wine press, where they used to make the wines 2,000 years ago. Of course, it's a modern built version built by Druze. Pickers used to come up with the grapes in here, then they used to lay them out on this limestone floor here. They used to stamp on them. The juice would go out through a rudimentary filter, which was normally some thorns in the hole there. They'd go through one filtration into another, and the amphora, the big clay containers, would receive the wine in here. This is the room where we used to hold tastings. Daniel Rogoff used to come for his annual tasting, used to sit here. It's a room reeking with history under the gaze of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. If you look around the wall, there's all the old labels of the bottles, which in itself is a fantastic decoration. Some of the labels were absolutely beautiful. Of course, the famous building, the yellow building, the first modern winery in 2,000 years, is celebrated in the Carmel Winery Limited Edition bottle, which is our prestige blend. It's a Bordeaux blend. And it features on the front label the building, the famous Rishon LeZion winery building. 120 years ago, there was no ventilation, and during the fermentation it produced carbon dioxide, which was dangerous. So the architecture of the day built these pagodas to get ventilation deep into the cellars. So each one of these pagodas represents the cellar, and we have the same pagodas in Zichron. So it's an interesting architectural detail. Every building at Carmel, which you see today, has a historical purpose. So this building here was the Mezgiriya, which is the metal workshop, and it's in the name of Abraham ben Moshe, who was the managing director here from 1987 to 2002. This gentleman by the name of Schwartz, he was the painter. It was painted in about 1990, I believe, and it represents the history of Rishon LeZion, the city, and also Rishon LeZion, the winery. It features different figures that have appeared in our history, and it tells a story from the harvest right the way through to the making the wine. This is James Rothschild, the son of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. In 1957, he donated Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov wineries to Carmel Winery. He also gave the money for the building of the Knesset. So here at Carmel, you've seen the history of Israeli wine, the history of the Jewish people in Israel, and also you'll see at Zichron Yaakov the Israeli wine revolution that's taken place. But this is one of the few places in Israel that is virtually a museum to the first Aliyah, to the building of the state, and to the building of an Israeli wine industry.